What if your great-grandmother's kitchen counter held more probiotic power than a $50 bottle at Whole Foods? And what if the Bible literally wrote down the recipe 4,000 years before anyone used the word probiotic? Here's the thing. A $50 probiotic capsule typically contains 2 to 5 bacterial strains. One jar of homemade kefir, made the way Abraham's household made it, may contain 30 or more. I want to be clear. I'm not saying fermented foods replace your doctor or your medication. This is educational content only. Please consult your healthcare provider. What I am saying is this. The Bible didn't just mention fermented foods. It built entire cultures around them. And we are only now beginning to understand why. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 20 of those fermented foods, ranked by the science, grounded in scripture, and priced for your kitchen tonight. And by the end, you'll know exactly which one to start with tonight for under $5. If you're new here, I share ancient wisdom backed by modern science every single week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now, before we get to number 1, I want to plant 3 seeds in your mind. One of these 20 ferments, not a supplement, not a pharmaceutical, actually outperformed a lab-grade immune booster in a 2023 study. We'll get there. At the very bottom of this list is a wine the Bible calls Tirosh. But many scholars say it wasn't wine at all. It was something much more alive. And there's one more ferment that starts as a thick golden syrup and ends up thin, dark, and literally fizzing with microbial life after 5 weeks. I'll show you exactly what that looks like. Alright, let's start with the full picture. 20 foods, 3 tiers, and 1 question to hold in your mind the whole way through. Here's what the next 13 minutes look like. First, why the gut crisis of 2026 isn't about what you're missing, it's about what we stopped doing 3 generations ago. Second, 20 biblical ferments ranked across 3 tiers, top 7 with the strongest clinical evidence, middle 7 with strong mechanisms and tradition, and the bottom 6 that close out with a biblical mystery. Third, a single ferment you can start tonight, under $3.50, no starter culture, no airlock, no equipment you don't already have. 13 minutes, 20 foods, 1 jar on your counter by the end of tonight. Let's go. Genesis 18, verse 8. Abraham ran to the herd, prepared a meal, and set it before his guests, along with curds and milk. That word curds in Hebrew is chema. Biblical lexicons confirm it refers to Leben, a fermented, cultured milk, not fresh milk straight from the animal. Here's why this matters. A 2026 review of 28 randomized controlled trials found that kefir may support increases in beneficial bacteria, including Akkermansia muciniphila and Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, and may be associated with reduced markers of gut inflammation. Traditional method: Caucasus, Central Asia, Middle East. Add a spoonful of kefir grains to fresh milk. Cover. Walk away 24 hours. That's it. Cost: under $3 a week once you have grains. 30 plus strains versus the 2 to 5 in a $50 capsule. Abraham was doing this 4,000 years before anyone built a probiotic lab. Number 2. Sauerkraut. Exodus 12, verse 8. The Passover meal required bitter herbs, sour, lacto-fermented vegetables that predate the European version of sauerkraut by thousands of years. Research from 2016 found that half a cup of homemade sauerkraut may contain nearly 6 million colony-forming units, well above the range considered effective. And a 2025 study suggested fermented cabbage extract may help protect gut lining cells from inflammatory damage. And this is the one you'll be making tonight. More on the exact method at the end. But first, number 3. Number 3. Yogurt. The same land flowing with milk and honey the Bible describes 11 times, that milk was almost certainly cultured. In Middle Eastern heat, raw milk ferments naturally within hours. Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus, the core strains in traditional yogurt, may support lactose digestion and are associated with improved gut transit in some studies. Number 4. Leben. Fermented camel and goat milk. Deuteronomy 32, verse 14. Curds of the herd and milk of the flock. The desert staple of Israel from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Goat milk contains smaller fat globules and different casein proteins than cow milk, making it naturally easier to ferment and, for many people, easier to digest. Traditional Leben was fermented overnight in goat skin bags. No refrigerator, no equipment. Number 5. Lacto-fermented cucumbers. 1 Samuel 17, verse 17. Jesse sent David to his brothers with provisions, and cucumbers preserved in salt brine were standard field rations across the ancient Near East. Lactobacillus plantarum, the dominant strain in lacto-fermented cucumbers, is acid-resistant. Research suggests it may survive transit to the colon, where it may support microbial diversity. Number 6. Brined olives. The Mount of Olives is mentioned over 50 times in Scripture. Psalm 128, verse 3, "Your children like olive shoots around your table." These olives were always brine cured, fermented before they were edible. Raw olives are intolerably bitter. Oleuropane, the bitter compound fermentation breaks down, has been studied for potential antimicrobial and antioxidant properties. The lacto-fermentation process also generates beneficial organic acids and live lactic acid bacteria cultures. Number 7. Boza. A lightly fermented cereal drink, millet, wheat or barley, with roots in Mesopotamia stretching back at least 6,000 years before the Common Era. Archaeological evidence at ancient Mesopotamian sites shows fermented grain drinks were central to communal life long before the Bible was written. Boza fermentation generates B vitamins, especially folate, through microbial synthesis. The combination of lactic acid bacteria and yeast also reduces phytate content, which may improve mineral absorption from the grain. That's your top 7, the ferments with the strongest combination of biblical roots, clinical research, and a cost under $5 a week. But here's the thing, the most surprising ferment on this entire list isn't in the top 7. It's number 13. And I told you at the beginning, it did something in a lab that I think will genuinely stop you. Number 8. Fermented lentils and beans. Daniel chapter 1, verses 12 to 15. Daniel asked to eat only pulse, vegetables and legumes for 10 days instead of the king's meat. At the end, he and his companions appeared healthier than those who ate the royal food. Traditional lacto-fermentation of legumes, soaking and wild fermentation for 24 to 72 hours, may reduce phytate content by up to 50%. Research suggests this may increase iron bioavailability by up to 85% and mineral absorption by up to 50%. Number 9. Fermented legume paste. The ancient Middle East fermented chickpeas and lentils into thick, pungent pastes, preserved with salt, thyme, and wild microbes. The biblical era analogue to what we call miso today. The fermentation generates free glutamate, the umami compound, along with short-chain fatty acids that may support gut lining integrity. It is the same basic biochemistry that makes modern miso a studied functional food. Number 10. Sourdough bread. Matthew 13, verse 33. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. That leaven, in the ancient world, was wild yeast and lactobacillus. It was sourdough. Sourdough fermentation may reduce the glycemic response of wheat bread, break down a portion of gluten proteins, and generate gamma-aminobutyric acid, a calming neurotransmitter, through bacterial activity. My grandmother kept a sourdough starter on her counter for 30 years. No refrigerator, no measuring. She fed it every morning and walked away. That is the lazy ferment principle in its purest form. Number 11. Fermented barley beer. Not modern beer. Ancient, low-alcohol, grain-fermented, consumed by Sumerian workers and documented in the hymn to Ninkasi, circa 1800 before the Common Era. It was bread in liquid form, the protein drink of the ancient world. Lacto-fermented grain beverages generate B vitamins, maintain live lactic acid bacteria culture, and were likely a significant source of microbial diversity for populations with limited food variety. The alcohol content in ancient versions was low enough to be consumed by workers and children. Number 12. Garum. Roman fish sauce, fermented fish packed with salt, was manufactured in industrial quantities at Ashkelon on the Mediterranean coast. 1st century Judea ran on it. It was the condiment on every table, including, almost certainly, the table at the Last Supper. Garum fermentation generates high concentrations of free amino acids, glutamate, and trace minerals from the fish. It is, essentially, an ancient umami concentrate, rich in compounds that support protein absorption. I told you at the beginning, this is the one. Here's the data. Numbers 11, verse 5. The Israelites in the wilderness remembered and longed for garlic. Exodus 3, verse 8. The promised land was literally defined by honey. These 2 foods appear separately across the text, but what happens when you ferment them together? In a 2023 study published in the Barley Medical Journal, researchers gave fermented garlic honey to mice over 21 days, alongside a pharmaceutical immunostimulant used as a positive control. The group receiving fermented garlic honey showed macrophage activity, that is, immune cell activation, of 84.6%. The placebo group, 55%. The pharmaceutical control, 75.6%. In this rat study, the fermented food group showed higher macrophage activity than the pharmaceutical control. Important note, this was a rat study. We do not have human clinical trials yet. Think of fermented garlic honey as a traditional tonic, not a guaranteed shield against infection, not medical advice. And here's the transformation I teased at the beginning. Day 0, thick, golden, barely moving. Day 35, thin, dark, literally fizzing. The osmophilic yeasts and bacteria have remodeled every molecule in that jar. Traditional use: 1 teaspoon daily, especially during cold season. Ferment for 4 to 6 weeks at room temperature. Cost: roughly $4 of raw garlic and raw honey versus $40 or more for commercial equivalents. Number 14. Smen. Cultured and salted butter, buried in clay pots and aged for months in North Africa and the Middle East. Genesis 18. When Abraham served his guests, the curds and milk were almost certainly accompanied by cultured butter like this. Smen's long fermentation generates short-chain fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin K2, which emerging research associates with cardiovascular and bone health. It is the ancient world's aged artisan butter.
That's your middle 7. And remember, loop number 2 is still open. We're almost there.
Number 15. Raw honey. The land flowing with milk and honey is mentioned 11 times across the Old Testament. And honey, unlike any other food, was the only one the Bible described as a complete gift of the land. No planting, no cultivation, no fermentation required. And yet, honey ferments on its own, slowly, when water content rises above 18%. Osmophilic yeasts, naturally present in raw honey, begin converting sugars to organic acids and trace alcohols. A 2023 study found that fermented honey may develop higher antioxidant capacity than raw honey alone, through increased phenolic compound activity. 1 teaspoon daily, room temperature, preserved indefinitely. The simplest ferment in this entire list, and the one the Promised Land was literally named for. Number 16. Fermented date paste. Deuteronomy 8, verse 8, lists the 7 species of the Promised Land: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. Jericho was called the City of Palms, a date palm city. Traditional date paste, left to ferment in warm conditions for 24 to 48 hours, undergoes lactic acid fermentation that may reduce the glycemic impact of the fruit's natural sugars and generate organic acids. The result is a thick, caramel dark paste, intensely sweet, lightly sour, that ancient travelers and soldiers carried as preserved field rations across the entire ancient Near East. Number 17. Vinegar. Ruth chapter 2, verse 14. Boaz said to Ruth, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." That vinegar, in the ancient world, was fermented sour wine, converted by acetobacter bacteria from ethanol to acetic acid. Research suggests that acetic acid may be associated with reduced blood glucose response after meals in some studies. 1 Timothy 5, verse 23. Paul told Timothy to use a little wine for your stomach's sake. The gut support tradition was not lost on the biblical writers. Vinegar was table medicine, fermented, functional, and found in every household from Mesopotamia to Rome. Number 18. Wine of Cana. John chapter 2. The wedding at Cana. Jesus turned water into wine, and the master of the banquet said the best had been saved for last. Biblical wine was Saccharomyces fermented grape juice, generating resveratrol, quercetin, and a spectrum of polyphenols from the grape skins. Research on resveratrol is mixed and ongoing. Small amounts of wine, in the context of Mediterranean dietary patterns, have been studied for potential cardiovascular associations. Important note: wine is not a substitute for medical care, and the research does not support using it as a treatment for any condition. The biblical tradition was moderation, diluted with water at the meal table, not supplementation. Number 19. Pomegranate wine. Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 2. I would give you spiced wine to drink, the juice of my pomegranates. Pomegranate fermentation generates elagitannins, which gut bacteria convert to urolithins, compounds currently being studied for potential effects on mitochondrial function and cellular health. Punicalagin, the dominant polyphenol, survives fermentation and may be associated with antioxidant activity. Fermented pomegranate juice has been produced in the Middle East and North Africa for thousands of years. It sits low on this list not because the mechanism is weak, but because the evidence is still early and the alcohol content places it in the same moderation category as wine. Number 20. Tirosh. And here is loop number 2. The one I told you about at the very beginning. The Bible uses the word Tirosh more than 30 times. Most translations render it as new wine. But scholars of biblical Hebrew tell a different story. Mitchell First, writing in the Jewish Link and the Sonsino commentary on Proverbs 3 verse 10, both confirm that Tirosh refers to must, the freshly pressed grape juice that has not yet completed fermentation. It is the living, bubbling 3 to 5 day window between grape and wine. Ancient winemakers in 1st century Israel allowed must to ferment openly in stone vats for 3 to 5 days before the liquid was moved and called wine. Tirosh was the alive version, high in wild yeast, lactic acid bacteria, and fermenting sugars. A transitional food the covenant communities celebrated as the first fruit of the harvest, before it became anything else. It sits at the bottom of this ranked list, not because it is without value, but because it is impractical to hold in that window at home. And the evidence for gut benefit at that stage of fermentation is thin. But as a symbol, it is the most honest ferment in the Bible. Alive, transitional, and celebrated before it was finished. Loop number 2, closed. And now you have seen all 20. From Kefir to Tirosh, from Abraham's tent to the wedding at Cana, from the wilderness to the winepress. Here is what this list is really telling you. The gut crisis of 2026 is not about what we are missing, it is about what we stop doing. 3 generations ago, your grandmother had a jar on her counter. Her mother had one. Her mother's mother had one. That chain of living fermentation ran unbroken for 10,000 years. And we broke it in a single generation. When we decided that shelf-stable, pasteurized, and manufactured was safer than alive. The science is now catching up to what the Bible already knew. A 2021 Stanford clinical trial found that people who ate 6 servings of fermented food per day for 10 weeks showed increased microbiome diversity and reduced markers of inflammation across 19 different proteins. Not a supplement, not a capsule. Fermented food. So here is what I want you to do tonight. 1 action. Under $3.50. Buy 1 medium green cabbage, weigh the shredded leaves. Add 2% of that weight in non-iodized salt, roughly 1.5 to 2 tablespoons per kilogram. Massage it with clean hands for 8 minutes until the brine pools at the bottom of the bowl. Pack it tightly into a glass jar. Press it down until the brine covers the leaves. Cover loosely. Set it on your counter at 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Walk away. At temperatures between 70 and 75 degrees, your sauerkraut will be fully fermented in 3 to 4 weeks. At 60 to 65 degrees, allow 5 to 6 weeks. Check it daily in the first week. Keep the cabbage below the brine. Skim any white film from the surface. On day 7, taste it. By day 21, you will have a jar of living, lactic acid fermented sauerkraut that may contain more colony-forming units per cup than the recommended effective range, for under $2 total. 1 jar, 1 counter, 10 minutes of work, 3 weeks of time. That is biblical homesteading. That is the chain of fermentation. And tonight, you rejoin it. Post a photo of your Day 0 jar in the comments. Tag it with the hashtag Biblical Homesteading. I read every single one. If this video gave you something, hit subscribe. I share ancient wisdom backed by modern science every single week. And if you are wondering which ferment to try after sauerkraut, kefir, fermented garlic honey, or sourdough, the answer is waiting for you in the next video. Not medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider. See you in the next one. Forgotten Healing Plants.